Most people living in Britain today are not descended from the ancient Britons in any meaningful sense. Not from the Ice Age hunters, not from the Neolithic farmers who raised Stonehenge. The people whose DNA actually dominates modern Britain came from the grasslands of what is now Russia and Ukraine. And within a few centuries of arriving, they had replaced roughly 90% of the population already here. Who were they? Where did they come from? And what kind of world produced a people capable of moving that far and displacing that completely? Stand on the Pontic-Caspian steppe around 3,500 BCE, and there is almost nothing to interrupt your view. Grass in every direction, feathergrass and fescue bending in a wind that carries no smell of wood smoke or turned earth, broken only by the wide, slow valleys of the Dnieper and the Don cutting south toward the Black Sea. No forests to speak of, no walls, no fixed points that tell you where one community ends and another begins. What there is, in every direction, is space. The landscape covers nearly 1 million square kilometers. It stretches from the lower Danube in the west to the Ural Mountains in the east, from the northern shore of the Black Sea up into the forest steppe, where the grassland thins into woodland. On a modern map, it looks peripheral, the edge of Europe, the edge of Asia, something in between. On the ground, in 3,500 BCE, it is one of the most strategically powerful landscapes on Earth. The reason is the grass itself. The grass feeds herds, and the herds feed people. And the people who have learned to move with the herds across this vastness have access to a resource base that the settled farmers to their west, with their fixed fields and their stone monuments, simply cannot match in terms of range. The people living here are the Yamnaya, a name archaeologists give to a culture that coalesced on the Pontic steppe somewhere around 3,300 BCE, though its roots run back several centuries before that. The name comes from a Russian word meaning pit, after their characteristic burial practice. The dead placed in a pit grave, often covered in red ochre, under an earthen mound called a kurgan. Those mounds still dot the Ukrainian and Russian steppe today, thousands of them, visible from miles away on ground, flat enough to make a slight rise read as a landmark. They are monuments to individual dead rather than collective ancestors. And that difference, the single grave under its own mound, not the communal long barrow full of mingled bones, says something essential about who these people are and what they value. Genetically, the Yamnaya are a mixture of two ancestral populations that came together on the eastern steppe roughly 2,000 years before the culture itself coalesces. Eastern European hunter-gatherers, people with deep roots in the forests and rivers of Russia, merged with hunter-gatherers whose ancestry traces to the Caucasus and northern Iran. Each contributed roughly half. The result is a population unlike anything to their west, taller than the Neolithic farmers of Europe, with a skeletal robustness that the grave measurements confirm, dark-haired and brown-eyed, and with skin that was intermediate in tone, lighter than the Western hunter-gatherers of Britain, but not the pale northern complexion that would come later. The combination of their genetics selected strongly for height. Yamnaya men were among the tallest people anywhere in the ancient world. Their economy runs on animals, cattle above all, the measure of wealth, the foundation of the diet, the reason the seasonal movement makes sense. Sheep and goats supplement the cattle herds. Horses, increasingly, do something new. The exact timeline of horse domestication for riding is still debated, and recent research has complicated older certainties about when exactly mounted riding begins. What the skeletal evidence from Yamnaya burials in Romania, Bulgaria, and Hungary shows is musculoskeletal damage to the femurs, hips, and lower vertebrae consistent with regular horseback riding, bone changes that develop across years of repeated stress in the saddle. These people are riding. How widely and how regularly is still being worked out, but the horse is no longer only prey or draft animal. It is transport. The wagon is the other revolution, and it may matter more for the migration that follows. Four-wheeled wagons pulled by oxen appear in Yamnaya burials. Actual wagons, placed with the dead in their pit graves, a statement about what a wagon meant to the person who owned one. They are not elegant vehicles. The wheels are solid discs of wood, heavy and slow. An ox-drawn wagon covers perhaps 10 to 15 miles a day, but it carries everything: the felt tent, the food stores, the tools, the children too young to walk far. With wagons, a community does not have to choose between its animals and its possessions. It can move both. The steppe, which previously required people to travel light and live lean, becomes a landscape that entire family groups can cross. The diet is meat and dairy heavily. Protein analysis of dental calculus from Yamnaya individuals confirms an economy built on animal products: fresh meat, dried meat, milk, and fermented milk products, possibly blood. There's almost no evidence of cultivated grain in their subsistence base. They are not farmers who also herd. They are herders entirely, and their bodies show it. The skeletal health indicators from Yamnaya graves are strong, with low rates of the dental decay that grain-heavy diets produce, and bone density consistent with physically demanding lives that are, nonetheless, well-nourished. These are large, healthy people living on the steppe's protein abundance. Lactase persistence, the genetic ability to digest fresh milk into adulthood, is spreading through this population at exactly this moment. The mutation had existed before, but the selective pressure to retain it intensifies sharply when your food supply depends on dairy animals. A person who can drink fresh milk efficiently extracts more nutrition from the same herd than one who cannot. On the steppe, where the margin between a productive season and a hard one is measured in animal condition and milk yield, that difference matters. The Yamnaya carry the lactase persistence allele at rates higher than any contemporary European farming population, and they will carry it westward with everything else they bring. And the social structure is organized around small family groups rather than large communal settlements. The Kurgan evidence is consistent. Individual burials under individual mounds, the grave goods marking personal status, weapons, metal ornaments, the occasional wagon, rather than collective ancestral belonging. There is hierarchy. The richest burials contain silver and copper, carefully placed tools and weapons, evidence of a person who accumulated and was recognized for it. Leadership is real and stratified, but the unit of daily life is the family moving with its herds, not the village rooted in its fields. Their belief world is harder to recover than their bones, but certain things are clear from the burial evidence. The dead are treated as individuals whose identity persists after death. The ochre that covers many bodies, the same red ochre that appears in burials going back to the Ice Age, marks the transition from living to dead with deliberate color, a pigment that costs effort to collect and apply. Carved stone stelae found at some Kurgan sites carry engraved human figures with belts, weapons, and the distinctive posture of people of status. The dead are not dissolved into a collective ancestry. They are commemorated as themselves, standing in stone above the mound that covers them, visible across the flat ground to anyone passing. The Kurgans serve as territorial markers as much as graves. Groups of them align in rows across the steppe, following the seasonal routes between winter pasture and summer grazing. They mark a path that a community has used for generations, announcing to anyone who reads the landscape that this route belongs to the people who built these mounds, whose dead are embedded in this ground. On a landscape with no natural barriers and no fixed settlements, the Kurgan line is the closest thing to a border. It says, "We have been here long enough to bury our dead here, and our dead hold this ground after us. The people who build these mounds speak a language that no one alive today has heard, Proto-Indo-European or something very close to it. It has left no written record. but its descendants are everywhere. The Celtic languages of Scotland, Ireland, and Wales, the Germanic languages that became English, Latin and its daughters French and Spanish and Italian, Sanskrit and Hindi and Persian. The vast majority of languages spoken in Europe today, and a substantial portion of those spoken across Asia, trace back to the language carried westward by the Yamnaya and their descendants. They did not know they were spreading it. They were simply talking and moving and taking their words with them wherever they went. Around 3000 BCE, something shifts. Whether it is climate pressure, a drying of the steppe that reduces carrying capacity and pushes people outward, or internal population growth, or the logic of pastoral mobility simply following its own momentum westward, the Yamnaya and their descendants begin moving beyond the steppe in sustained generational waves. The genetic signal that tracks this movement is one of the most dramatic in the ancient DNA record anywhere in the world. It appears in Central Europe, in Scandinavia, in the Iberian Peninsula, eventually in Britain. The steppe is emptying outward, and the world it is emptying into will not look the same again. Before anyone rides a horse, a person on foot covers roughly 20 to 25 miles in a day across open ground. A rider covers 2 to 3 times that distance, with less physical cost and more left in reserve at the end of it. The gap sounds simple. What it means in practice, in terms of what you can do, how far you can reach, what threats you can respond to, and what opportunities you can seize, is not simple at all. It reshapes everything about how a population can organize itself and project itself across a landscape. The precise timeline of when horses went from hunted prey to ridden animals remains one of the more contested questions in prehistoric research, and recent work has complicated what seemed, a decade ago, like a settled picture. The modern domestic horse lineage, the one that eventually spread across the entire world, has its origins in the Pontic-Caspian steppe in the lower Volga-Don region, with its expansion accelerating around 2200 BCE. That is later than the Yamnaya migration into Europe, which begins around 3000 BCE. Some researchers now argue that the Yamnaya expanded primarily on foot and by wagon rather than on horseback, and that large-scale horse-based mobility belongs to their successors rather than themselves. What is harder to dismiss is that people on the steppe are riding during this period, not as a fully developed equestrian culture, not yet, but enough that the horse is already changing what is possible. Men are riding to manage livestock and move between camps across distances that would take a walker days. The horse in the Yamnaya world is not the war horse of later steppe cultures. It is a working animal used for herding, scouting, and travel, modest in scale, significant in consequence, and spreading westward with the people who use it. The wagon is the clearer revolution, and its consequences are easier to measure. Four-wheeled wagons pulled by oxen appear across the Yamnaya world from the 3rd millennium BCE onward. The wheels are solid wood, heavy and slow. An ox-drawn wagon covers perhaps 10 to 15 miles a day on flat ground, less on rough terrain. Speed is not the point. Carrying capacity is. A wagon can move a felt tent, a season's worth of dried meat, tools, children, even elderly members of a family group across hundreds of miles of steppe that previously required people to choose between their possessions and their mobility. The wagon makes the choice unnecessary. The combination changes what pastoral life on the steppe is capable of producing. Before wagons, a mobile herding community is constrained in how far it can move by what its people can carry. With wagons, the constraint dissolves. Winter pasture in one river valley, summer grazing on the high steppe 200 miles north. The seasonal round can now span distances that a foot mobile community could never sustain while feeding itself. The herds grow larger because the range grows larger. Larger herds mean more food, more surplus, more people. And more people, moving across a landscape with no fixed barriers, now generate the demographic pressure that begins pushing outward beyond the steppe itself. What the horse adds to this picture, even in its early and limited role, is intelligence about the landscape. A rider can cover the ground between two grazing areas in a day that would take a walking herder several days. He can find where the herd has drifted overnight and bring it back before it crosses into territory that belongs to another group. He can carry news between camps, separated by distances that would otherwise require a committed journey. In a world where the margin between a good season and a disastrous one depends on knowing where your animals are at all times, this kind of mobility is not a luxury. It is management. The animals being ridden in this period are not large by the standards of later breeds. Compact, tough, and capable of surviving on grass that would not support a bigger animal, they are not the imposing war horses of later centuries. Riding them without stirrups, which have not yet been invented, requires significant core strength and balance. These are working riders in the practical sense, people who ride to manage livestock and move across ground, not yet the mounted warriors that steppe cultures of the Iron Age will become. The psychological effect on the populations the steppe people encounter as they move westward is worth considering alongside the practical one. The farming communities of Europe in 3000 BCE have no horses. They have oxen for traction, dogs for hunting, sheep and goats and cattle managed on foot. They have never seen a person mounted on an animal moving at speed across open ground. The first time a Neolithic farmer in Central Europe sees a rider coming across the plain, they are looking at something their entire cultural experience has no framework for. The advantage this gives the steppe people is not only in speed and range, it is in the simple, immediate fact of being utterly unlike anything the people they are encountering have ever seen. The expansion that eventually reaches Britain does not begin as a single coordinated migration. It begins as pastoral logic playing out across generations, herding communities following their animals into new ground, the frontier moving outward, not because anyone decided to move it, but because the system of mobile herding rewards expansion and has no natural internal limit. From around 3000 BCE onward, populations carrying steppe ancestry begin appearing in the European archaeological record in places they were not before. First in Central Europe, then in Scandinavia, then along the Atlantic coast. The genetic signal is unmistakable and consistent. Steppe ancestry arriving where no steppe ancestry existed, carried by people whose closest relatives were still living 1,000 miles east on the Pontic grassland. The first wave into Europe is associated with the corded ware culture, named for the distinctive cord-impressed decoration on its pottery, found across an enormous arc from the Rhine to the Volga, from around 2900 BCE onward. Corded ware people carry high levels of steppe ancestry, bury their dead as individuals under barrows, and organize their society around cattle herding and personal status in ways that echo the Yamnaya world they descend from. They are not Yamnaya in a direct sense. They are a population that formed somewhere in the contact zone between the steppe and the existing farming cultures of Eastern Europe, absorbing some farmer ancestry along the way, and then expanded westward and northward with a demographic momentum that transformed the genetic landscape of Northern Europe within a few centuries. What is striking about the ancient DNA from this period is not just that steppe ancestry appears in Europe, it is how thoroughly it replaces what was there before. In some regions of Northern Europe, steppe-associated ancestry rises from near zero to over 70% within the span of a few generations. A 2015 study by Hawk and colleagues, analyzing ancient genomes from across Europe, described this as among the most dramatic population turnovers visible anywhere in the ancient DNA record. The farming populations of Northern Europe, the same Neolithic tradition whose descendants built the long barrows of Britain, were largely displaced by incoming steppe ancestry populations before the Bell Beaker wave that eventually reaches Britain even begins. The Bell Beaker culture emerges out of this churning contact zone, coalescing most clearly in the Rhine-Meuse Delta region, the waterlogged lowlands of what is now the Netherlands and Belgium, around 2750 BCE. A February 2026 study published in Nature, the most detailed genetic analysis of the Bell Beaker phenomenon to date, traced the specific ancestry of the people who crossed to Britain directly to this Rhine-Meuse population. They were a distinctive genetic mixture, roughly 80 to 85% steppe-derived ancestry from corded ware migrants, with the remaining fraction from a local hunter-gatherer population that had somehow persisted in the Rhine-Meuse wetlands, thousands of years longer than hunter-gatherers elsewhere in Europe. The low-lying delta, too wet for easy farming, had sheltered a residual forager population that contributed its particular genetic signature to the people who would eventually cross to Britain. The Bell Beaker package, the material culture that moves with these people, is one of the most recognizable in all of European prehistory. The pottery that gives the culture its name is a bell-shaped drinking vessel, reddish in color, decorated with horizontal bands of geometric ornament pressed or incised into the clay before firing. It appears consistently across a geographic range running from Morocco to Poland and from Ireland to Hungary. The same object, in broadly the same form, across an area of several million square kilometers. Alongside it, copper daggers, archery equipment, including stone wrist guards protecting the bowman's forearm, gold ornaments, and a burial practice built around the individual rather than the collective. A single body, crouched on its side, with its personal equipment placed around it in a grave that belongs to no one else. What the Bell Beaker package represents has been debated for over a century. One view sees it primarily as a set of prestige goods, symbols of an elite status that spread through exchange networks, adopted by local elites who wanted the associations it carried without necessarily being the same people. Another view, now strongly supported by the genetics, sees it as a culture that moved with people, that the Bell Beaker material signature tracks a population movement rather than simply an idea spreading through existing populations. In Britain, the genetics settle the question. The Bell Beaker pottery arrives with Bell Beaker people, and those people replace the existing population at a rate that exchange networks alone cannot explain. The movement westward is not a single crossing. It is a sustained, multi-generational expansion that proceeds along river valleys and coastlines, following the logic of pastoral and maritime mobility that the steppe world had already refined. The Rhine is the highway. From the Rhine Delta, the Bell Beaker population expands south along the river toward the Alpine region and north toward the coast. It is from the northern end of this expansion, the coastal lowlands and estuaries of what is now the Netherlands, that the crossing to Britain is made. The people who arrive on the British coast around 2400 BCE are not travelers from the distant steppe. They are the descendants of several generations of westward movement, the leading edge of a wave that began rolling off the Pontic grassland a full 1,000 years before they set foot on British soil. The timing matters because Britain in 2400 BCE is not an empty island. The Neolithic farming population that replaced the Mesolithic hunter-gatherers 2,000 years earlier is still here. The builders of the long barrows and the causewayed enclosures, the people whose ancestors raised the first stages of Stonehenge. They are an established population with a relationship to this land built across 60 generations of continuous occupation. The Bell Beaker people crossing from the Rhine Delta are not arriving in a vacuum. They are arriving in a world that is already full, into a confrontation between two ways of living that is going to resolve with a thoroughness that the archaeology could not have predicted, and that the genetics, when it finally arrived, could barely believe. Britain in 2500 BCE is not a wild island. It has been farmed for 1,500 years. Now, the people living here are the descendants of the Neolithic settlers whose story was told in the previous video. The farmers who crossed from northern France and the Low Countries around 4000 BCE, who cleared the ancient wildwood and replaced the last hunter-gatherers who built the long barrows and the causewayed enclosures that still mark the landscape. Their descendants have had 60 generations to make this island theirs, and they have used the time. The population is small by any modern measure, perhaps 100,000 people across the whole island, but they are not thinly spread at random. They concentrate in the more productive zones, the chalk downlands of Wessex, the river valleys of Yorkshire, and the Thames, the fertile coastal strips of East Anglia, the Orkneys in the north. In these places, the cleared ground has been worked long enough that the communities using it have deep roots. Every family knows the ridgelines above their fields, knows which valley floods in a wet spring, knows where the best grazing runs in summer. This is not a population passing through. It is a population that has arrived, settled, and stayed. The great monument complexes of the late Neolithic are the clearest expression of what this society has become. Stonehenge, in its Sarsen form, is being raised around 2500 BCE, exactly the moment the Beaker people begin crossing the channel. The scale of the undertaking is almost impossible to absorb. Over 80 massive Sarsen stones, each weighing up to 25 tons, transported 40 kilometers from the Marlborough Downs and raised with nothing but wood, rope, and a coordinated human effort. The people raising it are not a culture in decline. They are, by the evidence of what they are building, at their peak. Durrington Walls, 3 kilometers from Stonehenge, is at its most active at precisely this moment. Communities are arriving from as far as Scotland and Wales to take part in the gatherings held here, bringing their animals with them, feasting on a scale that requires coordination across the full length of Britain. The site may hold more than 4,000 people in its busiest seasons, the largest concentration of people anywhere in Northwest Europe at this time. These are not isolated communities scratching a living from thin soil. They are communities capable of mobilizing labor, food, and people across the length of an island for shared purposes. The social networks that make this possible have been built across generations and are, in 2500 BCE, operating at full reach. Ideas and objects move across Britain with a fluency that the landscape does not obviously allow. Pottery styles originating in the far north appear in the south within decades of their development. People are moving along the sea routes of the western coast, up and down the river systems, along the long-established ridgeway paths on the chalk uplands. Britain is a connected world, and its communities know each other across distances that later ages would consider formidable. The belief system underpinning all of this is rooted in ancestral claim. The dead in the long barrows are not simply gone. They are held, kept accessible, returned to, yet their presence maintaining the community's right to the land they lie in. A long barrow on a hilltop visible for miles in every direction is not primarily a place of mourning. It is a statement. Our ancestors are here, their bones are in this ground, and this ground is ours through them. The living and the dead share the landscape together, and the dead carry weight in every decision about who belongs where. The people making these statements are shorter and darker than the people about to arrive, descendants of the Mediterranean farming populations who settled Britain 15 centuries earlier, with dark hair, dark eyes, and skin tones somewhat deeper than modern Northern European averages. They are a grain farming people, and their bodies carry that history, more dental decay than their hunter-gatherer predecessors. You have the physical profile of communities whose diet leans heavily on cultivated crops, healthy enough by the standards of their time, but not built the way the people crossing the channel are built. What they do not have, and what the people crossing the channel will bring, is metal. The entire technological world of Neolithic Britain is built on stone, bone, wood, and fired clay. Polished stone axes fell the trees, flint blades cut the meat. Copper has been worked in continental Europe for centuries, and bronze, the alloy of copper and tin that will define the next age, is already known on the continent. In Britain, in 2500 BCE, none of it has arrived. The people raising the sarsen stones at Stonehenge are doing so without a single metal tool. There is one detail from this moment that stops you, considered carefully. The people completing Stonehenge in 2500 BCE are not the genetic ancestors of most people alive in Britain today. The monument they are finishing at the exact moment the Beaker people begin arriving will stand for 5,000 years. The people who built it will be gone within a few centuries of completing it, their world replaced as completely as they once replaced the hunter-gatherers before them. They do not know this. They are raising stones that they expect to stand at the center of a living tradition indefinitely. They are not wrong about the stones, only about who will be standing beside them. The water between what is now the Netherlands and the southeast coast of Britain is not a great barrier by any standard these people have already cleared. They are maritime people. The Rhine-Meuse Delta is a world of estuaries. So tidal channels and open coastal water and moving through it by boat is not a specialist skill, but a condition of daily life. The crossing to Britain, roughly 200 kilometers at the widest point from the Delta to the Thames estuary, and shorter along the North Sea coast to the Kent shore, is within the range of watercraft already demonstrated in use along the Atlantic seaboard. These are not people staring at the horizon and wondering whether it is possible. They have already been doing it. The boats are log boats and sewn plank vessels, the same basic technology that had been crossing the Channel and the Irish Sea since the Mesolithic. The larger sewn plank boats, made by lashing planks together with withies and caulking the seams with moss or animal fat, could carry a substantial crew and cargo. Experimental reconstructions of Bronze Age plank boats, the Ferriby boats from the Humber estuary, dated to around 2000 BCE and the closest confirmed parallels, suggest craft capable of carrying several tons across open water in reasonable conditions. The North Sea is not hospitable, but it is predictable to people who read its weather patterns, its tidal rhythms, and its seasonal windows with the accuracy that comes from living beside it. The first evidence of their presence in Britain appears around 2400 BCE. At coastal and estuarine sites in the southeast, the distinctive Bell Beaker pottery begins appearing in the archaeological record, the same all-over corded style found at sites in the Netherlands. The genetic and ceramic link now confirmed by the February 2026 Nature study as a direct connection between the two populations. The steppe ancestry that has been absent from British genomes since the Neolithic replacement shows up abruptly at high levels in the earliest individuals associated with this pottery. There is no gradual build. The arrival reads in the DNA as a step change, not a seep. What the Neolithic communities in the southeast of Britain would have encountered when these boats came ashore is genuinely difficult to reconstruct in detail, but the broad outlines are clear enough from the material record. The Beaker people arriving are visually distinct from the population already here. They are taller, the steppe ancestry that dominates their genome selected strongly for height, and the skeletal evidence confirms it. They carry metal objects that no one in Britain has seen in functional use. Copper daggers, gold ornaments, so the distinctive stone wrist guards of the archer. They bury their dead differently. Single graves, crouched bodies, personal equipment placed around the individual, in a way that is the direct inverse of the collective long barrow tradition built into the landscape around them. The cattle they bring are worth pausing on, because cattle in this period are not simply livestock. They are the primary measure of wealth and the foundation of the economy these people have inherited from the Yamnaya world. A man whose grave contains the bones of cattle alongside his copper dagger and his beaker pottery is being marked as someone of substance in a system where animal ownership is the clearest available index of status. The Neolithic communities of Britain kept cattle too, But the relationship these arrivals have with their herds, the deep pastoral logic of a culture whose entire social world is organized around animal ownership and movement, is something qualitatively different from the settled farming relationship with domestic animals that the Neolithic world represents. The speed of the initial settlement is one of the more striking aspects of what the archaeology shows. Within 2 or 3 generations of the first arrivals in the southeast, Bell Beaker material culture is appearing at sites in Yorkshire, in Wales, in Scotland. The spread is not the slow seepage of an idea moving through an existing population. It tracks the movement of people. Communities are establishing themselves across the island with a rapidity that implies organized, sustained, true and deliberate colonization rather than a gradual trickle of individual migrants filtering into available land. The land they are moving into is not empty, but the evidence from this period suggests it may have been emptying. Pollen records and site distribution data point to a significant decline in Neolithic agricultural activity in the decades immediately before the Beaker arrival, possibly from soil exhaustion, pathogen exposure, or a combination of both. The timing appears to matter. The encounter between these two populations, the Neolithic builders of Stonehenge and the steppe-descended arrivals from the Rhine Delta, is not something the archaeology has resolved cleanly into violence or coexistence. The evidence from burials around Stonehenge suggests the two groups occupied the same landscape for a period, yet their material cultures occasionally appearing together at the same sites. But whatever the nature of the contact, its outcome is not ambiguous. Within a few centuries, the Neolithic genetic signature is effectively gone from the British record. The process that produced that outcome, whatever its texture, its pace, its degree of conflict or accommodation, is the subject of the next section. Within a few centuries of the first Beaker arrivals in Britain, roughly 90% of the island's Neolithic gene pool is gone. The figure comes from a study published in Nature in 2018, sequencing the genomes of hundreds of individuals spanning the Neolithic to the Bronze Age transition. The result stopped researchers cold. A population whose ancestors had occupied Britain for 1,500 years, who had built Stonehenge and the Long Barrow network and the causewayed enclosures, reduced to a 10% genetic trace within a time frame that, measured against the full span of British prehistory, is nearly instantaneous. The male line tells the starkest version of this story. Among the Neolithic people of Britain, the patrilineal ancestry carried by steppe populations is entirely absent. Among the Beaker-associated and early Bronze Age individuals who follow them, it accounts for the overwhelming majority of male lineages sampled. The women of Neolithic Britain survive in the gene pool at slightly higher rates than the men. The pattern visible in the genetics is of a replacement that fell harder on one sex than the other. What produced that asymmetry, whether it reflects violence directed preferentially at men, or intermarriage in which Neolithic women were absorbed into Beaker communities while Neolithic men were not, is a question the bones raise and cannot answer. How this happened is what the genetics raises and cannot itself resolve cleanly. The archaeological record for this period in Britain contains no confirmed massacre sites, no mass graves showing the kind of trauma that would point to organized military slaughter at scale. What violence occurred, and some almost certainly did, across a transition this fast and this thorough, did not leave a systematic signature in the ground. The absence of evidence for organized killing is not evidence that the transition was peaceful. It is evidence that it was complicated. Plague is one possibility that researchers take seriously. The bacterium responsible for plague has been recovered from ancient DNA in steppe-associated populations of this period, and if the Beaker arrivals carried a pathogen to which the Neolithic British population had no prior exposure, the demographic consequences could have been severe and rapid. A population already reduced by disease is far more vulnerable to the pressure of a growing immigrant population than a healthy one at full numbers. The two processes, epidemic and replacement, do not need to be separated. They may have operated together, each accelerating the other. Demographic arithmetic is the other mechanism, and it operates without requiring violence or disease to explain the outcome. The Beaker people arrive with an economy built around cattle herding, a system that produces surplus and supports faster population growth than the fixed-field farming it encounters. Their social world rewards the accumulation of herds and the production of children who inherit them. A population growing at even a modestly faster rate than the one it is displacing will, across 8 or 10 generations, transform a majority into a minority without a single deliberate act of aggression. The Neolithic communities of Britain may not have been conquered. They may simply have been outgrown. The contraction of Neolithic communities is visible in the archaeological record before it is visible in the genetics. Radiocarbon date distributions from Neolithic sites across Britain show declining activity in the centuries immediately before the Beaker arrival. Fewer sites occupied, smaller assemblages, less evidence of the large-scale monument building and communal feasting that characterized the late Neolithic peak. Whether this reflects population decline, agricultural failure, social fragmentation, or simply a shift in how people lived that the archaeology does not capture well. The Neolithic world was not at its height when the Beaker people crossed the Channel. It was already contracting. The Beaker people do not erase the monuments. Stonehenge continues to be used after the Neolithic replacement. There is evidence of Bell Beaker activity around the site, of burials in its environs that postdate the arrival. It's of the monument being incorporated into a new world rather than abandoned by it. The Amesbury Archer, the richest early Bronze Age burial found anywhere in Britain, was interred near Stonehenge around 2300 BCE with a spectacular assemblage of Beaker pottery, copper knives, gold ornaments, and archery equipment. Isotopic analysis of his tooth enamel places his childhood in the Alpine region of Central Europe. He is not a local man inheriting a local tradition. He is a continental arrival treating Stonehenge as a significant place, which means something of the older world's meaning survived the people who built it. The first centuries after contact show a period of genuine variability in the genetic record. The earliest Beaker-associated individuals in Britain range from those carrying almost entirely continental ancestry to a small number showing meaningful levels of Neolithic British ancestry. Evidence that the two populations were mixing at the margins during the initial phase of contact. After around 2000 BCE, that variability narrows. The Neolithic ancestry signal stabilizes at a low level and holds there, a remnant contribution, consistent and small, suggesting the mixing happened early and then effectively stopped. Whatever Neolithic communities persisted into the Middle Bronze Age, they were no longer large enough or coherent enough to contribute substantially to the continuing gene pool. What this replacement looked like from the inside, across the generations of people living through it, is the hardest thing to recover and the most important to try. A Neolithic elder in southern Britain around 2200 BCE would have spent their life watching communities they knew contract, watching individual Beaker graves multiply on ridgelines that once held collective long barrows, watching their children and grandchildren make accommodations with a world that was rewriting the rules of status, wealth, and belonging around them. The long barrow tradition, the ancestral claim expressed in collective bone, was built on a conception of land ownership that the Beaker world did not share and did not need. When the people who maintained that tradition were gone, the tradition went with them. This is the third replacement this series has told. The Mesolithic hunter-gatherers replaced by Neolithic farmers, the Neolithic farmers replaced by the Beaker people. Each time, the same basic arithmetic, a population with a demographic advantage overwhelming one that cannot match the rate of growth, sustained across enough generations until the original signal fades below the threshold of detection. None of these replacements required the previous people to be exterminated in the way the word can imply. They required only that the incoming population grow faster than the existing one reproduced. That is what the genes show. The human experience behind those numbers is something else entirely, and it is gone. The Beaker people crossed to Britain, carrying things that nobody on the island has ever held in their hands. Not in small quantities, not as curiosities traded across a long chain of exchanges, but as ordinary possessions, tools of daily life, objects familiar to the people carrying them in the way a flint blade was familiar to the people they were displacing. The gap between what already existed in Britain and what arrived with these people was not a gap in sophistication. It was a gap in materials, and the materials changed everything. Copper is the first metal to reach Britain in functional quantities, and even copper, soft by the standards of what follows, is harder than anything the Neolithic world had been working with. A copper dagger holds an edge that flint cannot match at fine tolerances, and unlike flint, it does not shatter when it meets bone. The earliest beaker graves in Britain contained flat copper knives and daggers, sometimes still sharp enough after 4,000 years in the ground to draw blood. These are not ceremonial objects. They were made to cut, and they were buried with people who used them. The discovery that changes the scale of the whole enterprise is bronze. Copper alloyed with tin produces a metal harder and more workable than either alone, capable of taking and holding an edge that neither stone nor pure copper can approach, castable into forms that flint can never be shaped into, repairable by remelting rather than lost when broken. Britain turns out to be uniquely positioned for this discovery. Cornwall and Devon hold the richest and most accessible tin deposits in all of Europe, sitting near the surface of the ground, waiting. When beaker metallurgists begin working the Cornish ore around 2200 to 2150 BCE, a bronze production does not creep in slowly. Britain becomes the first region in Europe to switch fully to tin bronze, and within a few centuries, its metal is being traded across the continent. The axe is the object that shows most clearly what bronze means in practical terms. A polished stone axe, the tool that cleared the Neolithic wildwood, is effective enough against a tree, but it chips and dulls and eventually fractures along grain lines that no amount of skill can predict. A bronze axe holds its edge through a working day that would have destroyed its stone predecessor, and when it dulls, it can be resharpened, and when it eventually wears out, it can be melted and recast. The forests that the Neolithic farmers had been slowly opening for 15 centuries could now be cleared faster, more efficiently, and with tools that did not need to be replaced each season. The landscape transformation that bronze enables across the early Bronze Age is not subtle. It accelerates. The horse reaches Britain with the Beaker people, or very shortly after, and its arrival changes the scale of movement across the island in ways that nothing since the development of boats had managed. A person on foot moves at the pace of a person on foot. A rider moves at a pace the island had never experienced before, able to cover in hours what previously required days, able to maintain contact between communities separated by distances that previously meant effective isolation. The trade networks that carry Cornish tin north and west, that bring Irish gold south and east, that connect the growing bronze-working centers of Wessex to the emerging elites of Yorkshire and Scotland, run on a combination of boats, rivers, and the emerging capacity for overland movement that the horse enables. The new burial practice is the change most immediately visible in the landscape, and it signals something deeper than a change in funeral custom. The long barrow, the collective tomb, the mingled bones of many generations, the ancestral claim expressed in shared stone, is replaced almost completely within a few generations of the Beaker arrival. In its place, individual graves, round mounds, a single body crouched on its side with its personal equipment arranged around it. Copper dagger, beaker pot, stone wrist guard for the archer's arm, sometimes gold ornaments, sometimes amber beads traded from the Baltic coast. Each object belonging to one person, marking one life, announcing that this mound is his and nobody else's. The round barrow is the kurgan, translated into a British landscape, and it multiplies across the ridgelines of Britain at a rate that makes the demographic shift visible from the air. The social world these objects express is organized around personal achievement and portable wealth rather than collective ancestry and fixed territory. A man's status in the beaker world is legible in what he owns and what he can give away. His cattle, his metal, his weapons, the amber and gold that demonstrate he is connected to exchange networks reaching across the continent. This is not a world without hierarchy. It has hierarchy built into every grave, every gift exchange, in every alliance sealed by a marriage between the daughter of one cattle-owning family and the son of another. But the hierarchy is dynamic in a way the Neolithic world's was not. It can be built in a single generation by a man who acquires enough animals and enough metal to make himself someone that other men want as an ally. The Boscombe Bowmen, 7 individuals buried together near Stonehenge around 2300 BCE, offer a window into the connected world the Beaker people built across Britain. Isotopic analysis of their teeth shows they grew up in Wales or possibly Brittany, moved to the Wessex region as adults, and were buried together with Beaker pottery and archery equipment in a grave that suggests they formed a coherent social unit. They are not locals. They are people who moved, who brought their connections with them, and who ended up buried together near the most significant monument on the island, treated in death with the same individual dignity the Beaker world gave everyone, but in numbers that suggest the ties between them mattered enough to keep them together even in the ground. The people who crossed from the Rhine Delta and remade Britain were physically different from the population they replaced, and the difference was visible to anyone who looked. The Neolithic farmers of Britain were shorter, darker in coloring, brown-eyed as a rule. The Beaker arrivals were taller, lighter in skin tone, with a higher frequency of lighter eyes and hair than anything Britain had seen before. Not the pale northern complexion of the modern imagination. That comes later, and the product of ongoing selection across the Bronze and Iron Ages, but noticeably different from the people already here. Anyone standing at the frontier between these two populations would have known immediately they were looking at someone from a different world. They were large people. The steppe ancestry running through them had selected hard for height across generations, and it showed, taller and broader than the Neolithic farmers they were displacing, more physically imposing in every encounter. In a world where status was performed in person, where alliances were made face-to-face and disputes settled by men who stood close enough to read each other, this was not incidental. These were people whose bodies announced them before they spoke. They ate well, and it showed in that too. Their diet ran on animals, meat and dairy above all, the pastoral inheritance of a culture that measured wealth in cattle and had done so for as long as anyone could remember. Where the Neolithic world had leaned on grain, these people leaned on the herd. Their teeth were stronger for it, their frames denser, their bodies carrying less of the wear that a life built on cultivated crops produces. They were not healthier because they were fortunate. They were healthier because their entire economy was built around the most nutrient-rich food sources the ancient world had available. The social world they built in Britain was organized around something the Neolithic world had no real equivalent for: the individual man of achieved status. Not inherited rank tied to collective ancestry, yet not the authority of the long barrow and the communal dead, but the standing of a man who owned cattle, who could use weapons, who commanded the loyalty of other men through demonstrated competence and the ability to give things away. Each life was measured on its own terms. One person, one death, one set of possessions that belonged to no one else. The long barrow tradition, with its mingled bones and its dissolution of individual identity into collective ancestry, had no place in this world. It did not survive contact with it. The language in their mouths belonged to the Indo-European family. the vast linguistic lineage that eventually produced the Celtic languages of Scotland, Ireland, and Wales, and through later migrations, the Germanic roots of English itself. They had no writing. Not a word they spoke was recorded. But the genetic thread is clear enough. The people who carried Indo-European languages into Western Europe were the steppe ancestry populations, and the Beaker people were their western edge. When Welsh and Irish and Scots Gaelic emerge from the prehistoric silence as documented languages, they are the daughters of something these people were speaking on the cleared ridges of early Bronze Age Britain, around fires, over cattle, in the particular cadences of a world that has left no direct recording, but whose outline the languages themselves preserve. Archery ran through the Beaker world as a constant. They were a people who practiced with the bow from childhood, who understood distance and wind and the patience required to close a shot, and who marked that identity in every formal context available to them. And the bow was not simply a hunting tool. It was a statement about who you were, the equipment of a person who could project force at distance, whose skill had been built across years of repetition, whose eye and nerve were things other men respected. In a world organized around personal capability, the archer occupied a specific and valued place. The drinking vessel that gives the Bell Beaker its name is more than a pot. These wide-mouthed, carefully made cups held fermented grain drinks and mead, early ale and honey wine, consumed at the gatherings where alliances were made and status was performed. The host who filled the cups was demonstrating what he had and his willingness to share it. The guest who drank was accepting something that created an obligation. In a social world built around personal relationships rather than institutional structures, the shared drink was not a pleasantry. It was a mechanism as serious as any contract, sealing the bonds that held communities together across the distances of an early Bronze Age landscape. The world they built across Britain in the 2 or 3 centuries after arrival was not a world in flux. By around 2100 BCE, the replacement is largely complete, and the early Bronze Age is already establishing its own rhythms. The metal trade networks running from Cornwall to the North Sea, the social hierarchies of a warrior elite visible and growing, the individual identity the Beaker people brought now so deeply embedded in British life that it has no serious competition. These are not migrants still finding their footing. They are a population that has made this island theirs, whose children and grandchildren have no memory of any other home, and who are building something on the ground they have taken that will define Britain for the next 1,000 years. A few centuries after the Beaker people first crossed the Channel, Britain has become a different country. Not transformed gradually the way the Mesolithic gave way to the Neolithic across centuries of slow ecological pressure, but reorganized within living memory. The old world still visible in the landscape, its monuments still standing, but inhabited now by different people who move through it differently, value different things, and measure a person's worth by entirely different standards. The island that once built communal tombs for mingled ancestral bones now buries its most important dead alone, or under their own mound, surrounded by everything they owned. The ridgelines of Wessex, Yorkshire, and the Scottish coast carry the mounds of those dead in their thousands. Individual lives marked in earth and stone, each one a statement about a person who mattered enough to be remembered this way. From a distance, they read as a landscape of the important, a visible record of who the community chose to honor. The people moving through this landscape every day are reading it the way a later age would read heraldry. Who built that mound? Who lies inside it? What it means for the people who claim descent from them. The richest lives of this period are connected to a trade world spanning the whole of Europe. Irish gold worked into flat sheet ornaments. In amber from the Baltic coast shaped into elaborate necklaces. The amber itself having traveled from the shores of the Baltic Sea across the North Sea and down through Britain to rest at the throat of a woman on Salisbury Plain. tin from Cornwall, moving in the opposite direction, eastward and southward, eventually alloyed into bronze tools and weapons used across the Mediterranean. These objects do not move by accident. They move because people with relationships on both ends of a journey make the movement possible, season after season, generation after generation. One man captures what this world looked like at its most powerful. He has grown up in the Alpine region of Central Europe, learned metalworking there, and made the long journey west and north to Britain, crossing the continent and the Channel with a limp from a knee injury that never fully healed. He settles near Stonehenge, already ancient by his time, already a place whose meaning draws people from great distances. And when he dies, around 2300 BCE, he is the richest man in Britain. 5 ceramic vessels, 17 flint arrowheads, 2 stone wrist guards, 3 copper knives, a metalworking kit with a portable anvil stone he has carried across half of Europe, and 2 small gold ornaments, the oldest gold objects in England, that he has worn in his hair. He has come from far away and made himself someone. That is exactly what this world rewards. Buried nearby is a younger man, almost certainly his son or close relative. They share a rare physical trait, a small inherited peculiarity of the foot bones that makes the connection unmistakable. The younger man has grown up partly in Britain, partly on the continent, moving between the 2 worlds his father moved between. He is buried with less, but with the same deliberate care, the same statement that this life mattered as an individual life. 2 generations, 1 family, their roots stretching from the Alps to Salisbury Plain, their world as wide as the trade networks that connected both ends of it. Those networks are running at full intensity by 2000 BCE. Cornwall and Devon hold the richest accessible tin deposits in Europe, and Cornish tin is crossing the continent in quantities that the Mediterranean world depends on for its own bronze production. A 2025 study traced tin from 4 Bronze Age shipwrecks off the coasts of Israel and southern France directly to southwest Britain. The Greek historian Herodotus, writing centuries later, referred vaguely to the Cassiterides, the tin islands far to the northwest. He was talking about Cornwall. The men smelting ore on the Cornish moors in the early Bronze Age are supplying the workshops of the eastern Mediterranean, whether they know it or not. The horse is increasingly central to how all of this moves. By the Middle Bronze Age, horses are being managed for regular travel across Britain, ridden and harnessed, their gear carefully made, their role in the economy no longer marginal. The pace of movement across the island, already faster than anything the Neolithic world achieved, is accelerating. Yonder a trader moving Cornish tin eastward toward the Thames estuary, a warrior riding the ridgeway between hilltop communities, a young man carrying news between his father's allies across 3 counties. All of them are covering ground in ways that the people who raised Stonehenge could not have imagined. The Britain that exists by 1500 BCE, metalworking, horse-using, connected to trade networks reaching the Mediterranean, its social hierarchies visible and growing, is recognizably ancestral to everything that follows. Not because its specific institutions survive intact. They do not. The Bronze Age will give way to the Iron Age to the Roman world to the Anglo-Saxon migrations. Each wave reshapes the island, but the genetic foundation laid by the Beaker people holds through all of it. When in the social logic they introduced, one person, one life, status built and demonstrated rather than inherited through collective belonging, runs forward from this moment into every age that comes after it. The Beaker people and their descendants are the primary genetic ancestors of most people living in Britain today. Not the Ice Age hunters, not the Neolithic farmers who raised Stonehenge. The people whose DNA dominates the modern British genome came from the Pontic Steppe by way of the Rhine Delta, crossed the Channel around 2400 BCE, and within a few centuries had become the population of this island in a way that no subsequent migration has fully undone. The Romans came and left. The Anglo-Saxons came and settled but did not replace. The Vikings added a layer in the north and east. The Normans added another at the top. Each wave contributed something. The foundation under all of it is Bronze Age steppe ancestry, and it has been there for 4,000 years. The languages spoken in Britain today trace back to these people through two separate roots. The Celtic languages, Welsh, Scottish, Gaelic, Irish, are the direct descendants of the language the Beaker people's successors spoke across Bronze Age and Iron Age Britain, surviving in the western margins where they were pushed by later arrivals and where they remain living languages today. English arrived later, carried by Anglo-Saxon migrants in the 5th and 6th centuries CEE, but it belongs to the same Indo-European family, a Germanic cousin of the Celtic languages rather than an unrelated tongue. When a Welsh speaker and an English speaker sit in the same room, and they are speaking languages whose common ancestor was alive on the chalk downlands of early Bronze Age Britain, in the mouths of people who had no idea they were founding a linguistic dynasty. The social inheritance is harder to trace with the same precision as the genetic or linguistic one, but it is there. The world the Beaker people built was organized around the individual. One person, one life, one measure of worth built through personal achievement and the portable wealth that demonstrated it. That logic runs through the Bronze Age, the Iron Age, and every subsequent period of British history in ways that are easier to feel than to prove. It is not the only value system Britain has ever operated on, but it is the oldest one still recognizably running. The ridgelines of Britain are still dotted with their mounds, over 30,000 round barrows surviving across the island, the most numerous prehistoric monuments in the landscape. Most are low and grassy now, easy to walk past without registering what they are. But they are everywhere, on almost every upland horizon, following the ancient routes between communities that have long since disappeared. They are not museums. They are the physical remainder of a world that was fully alive, fully inhabited, fully convinced of its own permanence, which is exactly what every world believes about itself, right up until it ends. The story told across this series began 42,000 years ago, with the first modern humans walking into Britain across the dry plain of Doggerland. It has moved through ice ages and warmings, through the drowning of a continent, through two near-total population replacements before this one. Each chapter ended with the people of that chapter gone or reduced to a trace, their world transformed beyond recognition. The Beaker chapter ends differently, not because the world stopped changing after them, but because the genetic line they established was robust enough to survive everything that followed. The replacements stop here, at least at the level of dominance. What comes after the Bronze Age adds and layers and shifts. It does not start again from scratch. The people who crossed from the Rhine Delta in boats around 2400 BCE did not know they were doing anything historic. They were following the logic of a pastoral world that rewarded expansion, moving into territory that was available, bringing their animals and their metal and their dead with them. They had no idea that the language in their mouths would eventually become Welsh and Gaelic and English. They had no idea that their blood would still be the dominant strain in the people standing on this island 4,000 years later. They were just people crossing water, looking for ground. The ground they found was Britain, and in finding it, they made it, in the deepest biological and cultural sense, what it still is.